Aliens came for conquest, expecting fragile primates clinging to a mud ball. They brought plasma rifles and orbital dreadnoughts. They forgot bug spray. They didn't account for rabies, apex predators, or the sheer spiteful hostility of a biosphere that eats its own. The massacre wasn't televised. It was composted. Sweat dripped down Cole's spine, pooling in the frayed, exhausted elastic of his underwear. August in the HFY basin smelled like rotting garfish, stagnant water, and wet copper. He slapped a mosquito against his neck. It left a bloody smear on his collar, a tiny sacrifice to the endless, droning hunger of the swamp. He didn't bother wiping it away. You didn't fight the swamp. You just surrendered pieces of yourself to it until it let you leave. Cole leaned against the sun-baked aluminum of his flat-bottomed skiff, chewing on a lukewarm piece of jerky that tasted vaguely of gasoline. He was supposed to be tagging invasive nutria. Instead, he was watching the sky tear open. It didn't happen with a majestic musical swell or a booming voice from the heavens. It happened with a shrieking, metallic, tearing sound that made Cole's molars vibrate. A streak of blinding violet light punched through the thick, humid canopy of bald cypress and Spanish moss about 2 miles east of his position. The impact didn't just shake the ground. It liquefied it for a fraction of a second. A shock wave of displaced, rotting air washed over him, carrying the sharp, chemical tang of ozone and burning synthetic polymers. Birds erupted from the canopy in a deafening, frantic cloud. Egrets, herons, and crows shrieked in mindless panic, abandoning nests and diving into the underbrush. Then, silence. Not a peaceful silence, but the suffocating, heavy quiet of a predator holding its breath. Cole spat a piece of gristle into the murky water. He checked the action on his bolt action. 30 to 06. A beat-up piece of iron and scratched wood that belonged to his grandfather, and shoved his flatboat off the mud bank. He wasn't heroic. He was just tired, underpaid, and deeply, foolishly curious. Pulling the skiff through the duckweed took an hour of agonizing, muscle-burning labor. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, filling his lungs with hot soup. By the time he reached the impact zone, his cheap canvas shirt was glued to his ribs. He tied the boat off to a drowned stump and crept up a slight ridge of relatively solid ground, sliding on his belly through ferns and briars. Thorns tore at his forearms. He ignored the stinging. Down in the depression, a crater of boiling mud and splintered timber smoked heavily. In the center sat a geometric impossibility. It was a drop pod, angular and chrome, pristine despite the violence of its landing. It looked like a high-end surgical instrument dropped into a clogged toilet. The hull hissed as it cooled, flash-boiling the stagnant swamp water it rested in. A seam appeared in the flawless metal. Hydraulic locks disengaged with a series of sharp, synthetic clicks. A ramp lowered, sinking immediately into the knee-deep black muck. Out stepped the invaders. They were tall, bipedal, and clad in armor that glowed with a soft, pulsing white luminescence. Helmets completely enclosed their heads, featuring sleek, opaque black visors. They held weapons that hummed with contained energy, sleek rifles devoid of magazines or bolts. There were 6 of them. They moved with absolute, rigid precision, forming a tactical ring at the base of the ramp. Cole watched, his breathing shallow, trying to calculate how fast he could run before that blue energy cut him in half. But he didn't need to run. He just needed to wait. The soldier on the far left took a step backward to widen the perimeter. Its heavy, armored boot didn't find solid ground. It found a submerged pocket of decaying methane and loose silt. The alien plunged down to its thigh with a loud, wet squelch. Cole winced sympathetically. He knew that mud. It was cold, cloying, and smelled like a century of dead things. The soldier flailed, its perfectly balanced center of gravity ruined. It grabbed the nearest sapling for support. The sapling was covered in poison ivy, but the armor protected the invader from the oils. It did not, however, protect the invader from the paper wasp nest hidden beneath the broad, waxy leaves. Cole heard a dull thud as the alien shook the tree. A black and yellow cloud erupted from the canopy. The Invaders' armor was designed to deflect hypervelocity shrapnel and dissipate plasma scoring. It was entirely sealed against chemical and biological warfare agents. But the joints at the neck, the microscopic intake vents for their environmental scrubbers, and the flexible mesh behind their knees were not designed to keep out aggressive, native Earth insects acting on pure territorial rage. The soldier in the mud began to twitch. Then it slapped its own helmet. The frantic, jerky movements were painfully untactical. Cole watched through his binoculars as a dozen wasps found a gap under the chin seal. A horrific, synthesized shriek broadcasted from the soldier's external speakers. It dropped its rifle into the muck. The weapon hissed, short-circuited, and went dark. The soldier tore at its own helmet, desperate to relieve the stinging, venomous agony occurring inside its sterile environment. The moment the pressurized seal broke, the humid, stifling air of the Louisiana swamp rushed in, carrying with it a fresh wave of angry wasps and the suffocating stench of sulfur. The alien collapsed, thrashing in the dark water, effectively drowning in 8 inches of mud. The other 5 broke formation. Panic, it seemed, was a universal constant. They aimed their sleek rifles at the buzzing air, firing bolts of superheated plasma. The violet beams vaporized the water, creating blinding clouds of steam that only worsened their visibility and baked them inside their suits. Cole lowered his binoculars, resting his chin on his crossed arms. He felt a profound sense of absurdity. He had spent his whole life fighting the slow, miserable decay of this biome. He knew every parasite, every hidden root, every venomous scale that called this place home. These beings had crossed the stars, mastered faster than light travel, and built weapons of godlike power. And they were losing to bugs. The steam cleared, leaving the 5 remaining invaders standing in a sauna of their own making. The ambient temperature in the crater had spiked to well over 120 degrees, and the humidity was effectively 100%. Cole could see the faint, glowing blue coolant lines on their armor flickering, struggling to shed the immense heat trapped beneath the dense canopy. They had dragged their fallen comrade onto the ramp of the ship. The body lay motionless, helmet off. Cole caught a glimpse of the alien's face, pale, hairless, with wide-set eyes and delicate recessed nostrils. It looked refined, fragile. It looked like something that had never possessed an immune system, let alone a defense against neurotoxins. The commander, denoted by a red stripe across its visor, began issuing rapid, clicking commands over their external speakers. They formed a tight circle, weapons raised, scanning the dense palmetto bushes and towering cypress knees. They were looking for an army. They were looking for soldiers, tanks, artillery. The swamp didn't have tanks. It had teeth. Twilight was approaching, painting the humid air in bruised shades of purple and orange. The cacophony of the day was fading, replaced by the sinister, rhythmic pulsing of the night shift. Frogs began their guttural choruses. Cicadas screamed their abrasive, mechanical whine. The sensory overload was absolute. Cole watched the invaders activate their targeting optics. Beams of red and green swept the underbrush. It was a fatal mistake. In the HFY, you didn't use active illumination unless you wanted every hungry thing in a 5-mile radius to know exactly where you were. The red beam of the commander's rifle swept across a patch of duckweed about 30 yards from the ship. 2 small glowing embers reflected the light back. Cole knew those eyes, spaced far apart, low to the waterline. The commander paused. It took a step forward, raising its weapon, trying to resolve the thermal signature. But a cold-blooded ambush predator doesn't show up well on infrared. The alien saw only the ambient, suffocating heat of the mud. The water exploded. It wasn't a graceful strike. It was 12 feet and 600 pounds of prehistoric muscle, armor-plated scales, and absolute, indiscriminate fury. The alligator lunged from the black water, its massive jaws snapping shut on the commander's left calf. The sound of the alien's leg armor crumpling was like a car door being crushed in a hydraulic press. The commander screamed, a high, mechanical sound of sheer terror, and fired its plasma rifle wildly into the canopy. Severed branches rained down around them. The other soldiers panicked, turning their weapons on the water, but the gator was already doing what it was evolved to do. It initiated the death roll. The alien was thrown off its feet, violently twisted into the deep mud. The sheer torque shattered the intricate servos in the armor and snapped the fragile bones beneath. The water churned into a frothy, bloody slurry. The plasma rifles hissed and popped as they fired indiscriminately, searing the mud and filling the air with a stomach-churning smell of burnt algae and cooked flesh. One of the soldiers took a step back, trying to line up a shot on the thrashing reptile, and backed directly into a thick, hanging cluster of Spanish moss. The moss was home to a colony of brown recluse spiders, driven outward by the heat of the plasma fire. Cole watched as the soldier frantically swatted at its neck and shoulders, slapping at the tiny, unseen invaders that had found the broken seal where the helmet locked into the chest plate. The soldier dropped its weapon, staggering away from the group, tearing at its own armor, plunging headfirst into a briar patch, in a desperate attempt to scratch the burning agony spreading through its nervous system. Cole lay perfectly still, his breath shallow, a grim, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. He felt a weird, disconnected pity. They had no idea. They thought they were invading a planet of soft, domesticated apes. They didn't realize the apes were just the species that had managed to endure this hellhole. The remaining 3 soldiers abandoned the commander. It was a cold, calculated military decision. They retreated up the ramp, dragging their uninjured limbs, desperate to seal themselves back inside the sterile safety of their drop pod. But the noise, the frantic splashing, the shrieking, the thunder of plasma fire, it had acted like a dinner bell. A low, rumbling grunt echoed through the palmettos behind the ship. It wasn't one grunt. It was a chorus of them, deep, chest-rattling snorts that made the hair on Cole's arms stand up. Feral hogs. They weren't natural. They were an invasive species themselves, a nightmare hybrid of domestic pigs and Russian boars, bred for survival and pure aggression. They were walking tanks, covered in thick mats of mud and scar tissue, driven by an insatiable metabolism and a foul temper. And there was a sounder of at least 20 of them breaking through the underbrush. The lead boar, a massive, scarred beast with tusks the size of carving knives, burst from the ferns. It didn't pause to assess the tactical situation. It saw a glowing, metallic thing standing in its territory, and it charged. The closest alien fired. A bolt of plasma struck the boar directly in the shoulder. Cole winced, expecting the animal to explode. Instead, the intense heat instantly cauterized the wound, burning away the thick layer of dried mud and hair, searing the fat underneath. The boar squealed, a sound of demonic rage, stumbled for a fraction of a second, and hit the alien at 30 miles an hour. The impact lifted the invader off its feet. The boar's tusks found the flexible mesh at the alien's waist, tearing through the advanced polymers like wet tissue paper. The invader crumpled, shrieking, as the rest of the sounder poured out of the brush, a tidal wave of bristling hair, clacking teeth, and brute force. They didn't care about the plasma burns. They didn't care about the flashing lights. They cared only about destroying the things that had intruded on their swamp. The remaining 2 soldiers on the ramp fired blindly into the mass of hogs, cutting down 3 or 4, but the sheer momentum of the beasts carried them forward. The aliens were overrun, pulled down into the mud, their advanced armor offering 0 protection against the crushing weight and tearing jaws of a dozen starving omnivores. Cole slowly slid backward, inching his way down the ridge toward his boat. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, scorched pork, and alien blood. He didn't need to fire a single shot. He just needed to go home, take a cold shower, and let the earth do what it did best: consume. Rain began to fall. Not a gentle, cleansing shower, but a heavy, oppressive deluge, typical of the Gulf Coast. Fat, warm drops smacked against the murky water like thrown pebbles, dimpling the surface of the duckweed. Cole sat in his aluminum skiff, the metal ringing dully beneath his wet boots. He ran a calloused, mud-stained hand down his face, wiping away the mixture of sweat and rainwater that stung his eyes. He should have been paddling away. He should have been putting as many miles of winding, mosquito-choked bayous between himself and that smoking crater as humanly possible. Instead, he sat there, his oars resting across his knees, listening to the unnatural hum vibrating through his jawbone. It wasn't a sound, exactly. It was a frequency, a low rhythmic throbbing that felt like a migraine trying to hatch behind his eyes. He looked back toward the impact site. Through the gray sheets of rain, a beam of harsh, pale blue light lanced upward from the crash drop pod, piercing the thick canopy and disappearing into the bruised storm clouds. A distress beacon, or a targeting laser. Cole didn't know which, and he didn't care. What he knew was that if a galactic armada thought this mudhole was a viable landing zone, they would send more. And if they sent more, they wouldn't just get eaten by hogs and alligators. They would start burning the swamp to sanitize it. They would burn the town of Henderson. They would burn his trailer, his dog, and the handful of people he begrudgingly tolerated. Cole let out a long, ragged exhale that smelled of stale coffee and exhaustion. "Stupid," he muttered, his voice raspy and swallowed instantly by the drumming rain. Incredibly, remarkably stupid. He grabbed the heavy wooden oar and dug it into the soft, yielding muck of the riverbed, turning the skiff around. Every muscle in his shoulders screamed in protest. The adrenaline from the initial shock was fading, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his joints. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a janitor walking into a massive, biohazardous mess with nothing but a mop. The journey back to the ridge took twice as long. The storm was churning the water, turning the stagnant pools into swirling, muddy eddies. By the time Cole tied off his boat to the same drowned cypress stump, his cheap canvas jacket was soaked through, clinging to his skin like a cold, wet bandage. He slung his grandfather's 30-06 over his shoulder, the wooden stock slippery in his grip, and grabbed a heavy, rust-pitted pipe wrench from his tackle box. He crawled up the ridge, the rain washing the worst of the mud from his jeans but replacing it with a bone-deep chill. He peered over the edge of the briar patch. The carnage on the ramp was gone. The feral hogs had retreated into the palmettos, dragging their metallic, screaming prizes with them. All that remained were deep, churning gouges in the mud and thick smears of translucent, violet fluid that washed away quickly in the downpour. The drop pod itself sat like a breached whale, its pristine geometric lines marred by deep scratches, mud, and scorch marks. The ramp remained lowered. The blue beam pulsed steadily from a housing unit near the top of the open airlock. Cole slid down the muddy bank, his boots sinking past the ankles. The smell was completely different down here. The rain had beaten down the sulfurous stench of the swamp, but it had trapped the unnatural odors of the alien craft. It smelled like a hospital ward that had caught fire, antiseptic, ozone, and melting synthetic polymers. He stepped onto the ramp. The metal was strange. It didn't feel like steel or aluminum. It yielded slightly under his weight, almost like a dense, cold cartilage. His wet rubber boots squeaked loudly against the surface, a jarring, mundane sound in the middle of an extraterrestrial shipwreck. He kept his rifle lowered, his finger resting outside the trigger guard. If there were any active defenses left, a bullet wouldn't help him. He hugged the right side of the airlock, stepping carefully over a severed, armored gauntlet left behind by the hogs. The interior of the ship was a stark contrast to the chaotic, messy biology outside. It was all smooth curves, soft white lighting, and control panels devoid of buttons or levers. But the swamp was already claiming it. Muddy water poured over the threshold, pooling in the sterile white corridors. Leaves, twigs, and duckweed clung to the walls, carried in by the violent scuffle. Cole moved deeper, following the throbbing pulse of the beacon. The air inside was stiflingly hot. The cooling systems had failed entirely. It felt like walking into a dry sauna, sucking the moisture right out of his lungs. He turned a corner into what looked like a central command hub. A raised dais sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by holographic projections that flickered and glitched, casting eerie stroboscopic shadows against the bulkheads. And there, slumped against the base of the console, was the last invader. It didn't have its helmet. Cole finally got a good look at it under the harsh, flickering light. The alien's skin was the color of skim milk, laced with delicate, glowing blue veins. Its eyes were massive, black pools reflecting the holographic displays. It was clutching its abdomen, where a ragged, gaping wound leaked that strange violet fluid onto the pristine floor. A piece of jagged, scorched wood, a splinter from a cypress tree blown apart by their own plasma fire, was lodged deep in its side. The creature looked up at Cole. There was no defiance in its massive eyes. No predatory malice, just absolute, unadulterated terror. It looked like a deer hit by a truck, trembling, gasping for an atmosphere. Its lungs weren't designed to breathe. Cole lowered his rifle. He felt a sickening twist in his gut, a deep, uncomfortable pity. He wasn't looking at a conqueror. He was looking at a victim of the most arrogant miscalculation in military history. The alien raised a trembling, multi-jointed hand, pointing a small metallic cylinder at Cole, a sidearm. Its fingers shook so violently it could barely hold the weapon. Cole didn't dive for cover. He didn't execute a tactical roll. He just stepped forward, his wet boot slipping slightly on the bloody floor, and kicked the alien's hand. It wasn't a clean martial arts strike. It was clumsy and heavy. His rubber toe caught the creature's wrist. The bone snapped with a sound like a dry twig breaking. The alien let out a pathetic, bubbling wheeze, dropping the cylinder. It curled in on itself, clutching its broken arm, pressing its face into the muddy water pooling on the floor. "Sorry," Cole rasped, his voice sounding incredibly loud in the humming cabin. He actually meant it. He stepped over the trembling creature and looked up at the console to find the source of the beacon. Above the dying alien, the holographic displays told a story of profound, suicidal hubris. Cole didn't need to understand their glowing geometric language to read the map projected in the center of the room. It was a rendering of Earth, glowing softly in emerald and sapphire light. Clustered across the continents were thousands of pulsing red dots. Drop zones. Cole leaned closer, wiping rain and sweat from his brow, his eyes tracing the coordinates. Every single red dot was far away from human population centers. They were in the Amazon basin, the Siberian tundra, the Australian outback, the deepest trenches of the Congo. He let out a short, humorless bark of a laugh that scraped his throat. He understood. The invaders had scanned the planet for artificial structures, for military bases, radar installations, and electrical grids. They viewed human cities as fortresses. So, they decided to bypass our defenses entirely. They chose to stage their invasion forces in the wild, uninhabited zones, intending to marshal their strength in secret before marching on the capitals. They thought the empty spaces were safe. They thought nature was just scenery. They had deployed their entire vanguard straight into the teeth of the most hostile, aggressive, and perfectly adapted biological meat grinders in the galaxy. Cole imagined drop pods sinking into quicksand, alien platoons being swarmed by driver ants, sterile soldiers contracting malaria, dengue, and unclassified fungal spores within minutes of breaking their seals. The invasion wasn't a war. It was a massive, interplanetary feeding frenzy. A sharp, chemical burning sensation on his ankle dragged Cole out of his thoughts. He looked down, instinctively slapping his leg. His hand came away smeared with a crushed, reddish-brown insect. The burning sensation intensified, spreading rapidly up his calf. Fire ants. He swept his flashlight across the floor. The water that had pooled in the airlock wasn't just bringing in mud. The broken thermal regulators of the ship were radiating a massive amount of residual heat, creating a dry, warm microclimate inside the hull. The torrential rain outside was flooding the swamp, drowning the intricate subterranean colonies of the local insect populations. Driven by instinct, the ants were seeking high, dry, warm ground, and they had found the drop pod. A literal carpet of moving, seething red covered the floor near the entrance, advancing into the command hub. It wasn't a few dozen. It was hundreds of thousands of them, moving in a unified, aggressive wave. They climbed over the pristine white bulkheads, searching for anything soft, anything biological, anything they could bite. They found the alien. The creature let out a high-pitched, warbling shriek as the vanguard of the colony reached its boots and began to swarm up its legs. The ants didn't care about advanced polymers or genetic engineering. They only knew that this pale, bleeding thing was in their new territory. Cole watched in visceral horror as the red tide moved over the creature's wounds. The alien thrashed wildly, its broken wrist flopping sickeningly, tearing at its own face as the ants found the soft, moist tissue of its eyes and recessed nostrils. The sheer volume of the insects muffled the creature's screams, filling the room with a dry, rustling sound, like static electricity. Cole stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent his whole life surrounded by the casual cruelty of nature, but this was different. This was intimate. It was an execution by a million tiny, venomous jaws. He couldn't save the creature. To try would just mean getting swarmed himself. But he could stop the beacon. He turned to the glowing console. The pulsing blue light was housed inside a thick, crystalline cylinder. Cole gripped his heavy pipe wrench with both hands. He didn't look for a shutdown sequence. He didn't try to hack the mainframe. He just swung the heavy iron tool like a baseball bat. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arms, vibrating into his teeth. The crystal didn't shatter on the first hit. It chimed, a high musical note of protest. Cole grunted, his boots slipping on the wet floor, and swung again, putting his back into it. The wrench connected with a deafening crack. The crystal shattered, spraying glittering razor-sharp shards across the room. One sliced across Cole's cheek, drawing a hot line of blood, but he ignored it. Inside the housing, a series of delicate, glowing conduits sparked and hissed. He raised the wrench and brought it down like a hammer, crushing the internal electronics into a tangle of dead wires and leaking coolant. The throbbing hum in his jaw ceased instantly. The beam of light shooting into the sky flickered and died. The holographic map of Earth sparked, folded in on itself, and winked out, plunging the command hub into heavy, suffocating shadows, illuminated only by Cole's flashlight. The alien had stopped screaming. It lay completely still under a shifting, undulating blanket of red. Cole backed out of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't turn his back on the swarm until he was through the airlock. He practically fell down the ramp, plunging knee-deep into the cold, muddy water of the swamp, relishing the chill that numbed the ant bites on his ankle. He waded back to his skiff, untied it with shaking hands, and pushed off into the driving rain. He didn't look back at the ship. He just rode, letting the rhythmic, agonizing burn in his shoulders anchor him to reality. The storm raged around him, a violent, beautiful display of atmospheric chaos. The swamp was loud. The rain, the wind, the croaking of frogs celebrating the deluge. It was the sound of a planet digesting its prey. The invaders had brought fire and steel to a world of mud and blood. They thought they were gods, descending upon a fragile sphere. They never realized that Earth was just a massive, open-air stomach, and they were nothing more than an exotic meal. Cole spat a mixture of rainwater and blood into the bayou. He had to go to work on Monday. The nutria weren't going to tag themselves. If you felt the mud, the rain, and the raw brutality of Earth's untamed wilderness in this story, crush that like button and share this video with a friend who loves gritty HFY sci-fi. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another tale where humanity and our terrifying biosphere teaches the galaxy a lesson in survival. Drop a comment below. Which Earth environment do you think would be the ultimate alien death trap?